All right, everybody, let's get started. I want to start today by going over what we're going to do this week, okay? First, I'll answer any questions regarding exam one. I'll go over that real quick. Two, we're picking up with the information at the time of the Renaissance. And I plan on completing this material by the end of tomorrow. And during tomorrow's meeting, I will also go over the exam itself, okay? And so that you know exactly what information you're going to need to focus on. Obviously, I'll go over and answer any questions you might have regarding all the material presented to you. Like exam one, I am going to send you exam two on Wednesday morning, and you will have the entire day to turn it back into me by Thursday morning at 9 o'clock a.m. Okay, so there will not be a Zoom meeting on Wednesday. We'll meet tomorrow on Tuesday, and then we won't meet again until Thursday. Okay. Now, after we complete exam two, exam number three is the final exam. The final exam is not cumulative. It'll merely be exam number three. And it has to do with Asia. You already know that. But anyway, that's how it's going to play out for the remaining part of the semester. So any questions so far about what we're going to do here? Okay. All right. Exam one, I think all of you got your grades. Overall, you did very well. There was a lot of 80s and 90s in there. The high grade was a 98. Congratulations to that person. And so for many of you, I completely understand this probably isn't the most exciting material, and it's a required elective class, but I do appreciate the fact that you spent some time on it, at least, you know, going over the material, and it reflected in the grades I saw. There was a lot of 80s and 90s, so very good, everybody. Not very many of you struggled with it. Like I said, overall, I think the grade curve was slightly on the positive side. So I think the average grade was probably in the low 80s somewhere. So does anybody have any specific questions about exam one? No? Okay. So I want to pick up where I left off last week. And once again, as a reminder to you, the theme that I am trying to weave through this material is the relationship of the religious system and the political system in the cultural development of Europe. Quick recap here, everybody. It's going to be Emperor Constantine who is going to legalize Christianity. After his death in 337, another emperor by the name of Theodosius in the year 380 AD is going to make Christianity the official faith of the empire. So after the year 380, Romans are Christians. They're not pagans anymore. Okay. The empire is divided. There's an east and a west half. The capital city is in Constantinople. There are 5 patriarchs within the church. 4 of them are located in the east. 1 is in the west. And the 1 is the person we refer to as the Pope. As time goes on, the eastern half of the empire is going to start the whole empire is going to start dividing culturally. And probably the most significant event that's going to help create this cultural divide between the 2 halves of the empire is that the eastern half of the empire is going to start speaking Greek. The western half of the empire is going to still remain speaking Latin. Okay. That is going to create differences in philosophical opinions over the interpretation of the Bible. In the West is where I then focused on. And I said that over the centuries, now that the Roman government is no longer in Rome, the area of Europe that you now know as Italy is going to be overrun by barbarian tribes. And on 2 separate occasions in the 5th century AD, the city itself is going to be entered by invading armies. The city is going to be ransacked. And in each case, the representative that was able to spare the lives of the population was the Pope. He was the only figure of authority left behind. And so what quickly starts to develop is an allegiance by the population more towards the Pope himself than the actual emperor in Constantinople. Because the Pope is physically close to them. He's in the city of Rome, and he's right there negotiating with the tribal chiefs, sparing the lives of the population. And so there's a beginning of an allegiance. The population of Europe has, in this time frame, everybody, has absolutely no concept of nation states. This is absolutely foreign to them. That thought would never occur to them. So if you asked anybody in the 5th century and beyond, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, doesn't matter. If you ask anybody, who are you? The first phrase out of their mouth is going to be, I'm a Christian. The concept of declaring that, oh no, I'm a Frenchman, that is completely foreign thinking at this time period. Okay. So in terms of converting all of these tribesmen to Christianity, that was not the problem. Christianity was able to convert much of the European population relatively quickly. The problem was competing with all of the old pagan beliefs and superstitions. And the church is going to combat this at times very vigorously. In other words, they're going to start burning people at the stake and whatnot for practicing what was called heresy. And essentially, the church is trying to root out all of these these old pagan beliefs. And a lot of these tribesmen found it very difficult to give up the old gods, you might say. And so as centuries go on, the church slowly starts, they give up on trying to fight because these people just won't give up some of these beliefs. And so the church starts to incorporate some of them in the general philosophy of the church. You know, the idea of saints was never mentioned by Jesus Christ. There was no discussion of that. Idea of creating saints did not happen until about the 6th or 7th century. And so the church is basically trying to adapt to the European population that it has inherited. The Romans aren't there anymore, the Roman government. And so the church is basically left with, okay, we've got all of these, you know, tens of thousands of tribesmen all over Europe, and, you know, we got to somehow civilize them and somehow all get them to believe in the same Christian faith. And so at this time period as well, everybody, the Muslim empire finally arrives on the scene in about the year 632 AD. And from that time forward, there is a rapid expansion of Muslim territory. Muslim armies are going to start spreading across North Africa, and they're going to start spreading up into the Middle East. And they obviously come into conflict with the Christian community, you know, the Roman Empire. And so it's the beginning of the end, you might say, for the Roman Empire. The Muslim armies are going to attempt to invade Europe itself. And so in these early years, while the church is trying to not only baptize everybody, but somehow root out all of these superstitions and pagan beliefs, they've also has to contend with the occasional invasion of some form of a Muslim army. A dozen warships might suddenly show up off the coast of Italy and come in and start raiding cities and villages and robbing and raping and taking slaves. And so the Pope needs a protector. And so he comes into alliance with one of these tribal chiefs. His name is Charlemagne. And in the year 800 AD, Charlemagne is the first conqueror of Europe. He accomplished this through sheer, not just force of military arms, but force of personality. Charlemagne was a very domineering individual. This is the year 800 AD, and imagine that the average size of a man at that time period was probably 5'7", and he maybe weighed 140, 150 pounds. Charlemagne is 6'4", and he weighs about 250 pounds. When he walks into your tent, you pay attention. And so in order to culturally unite his empire that he has created out of Europe, he rides down to the city of Rome and he kneels before the Pope. And the Pope places a crown on his head. And that is going to set a precedent. You want to be a legitimate king in Europe, then you need to ride to Rome and kneel before the Pope. And the religious system now has a tremendous amount of power and influence over the political system within Europe. Charlemagne is the very first Holy Roman Emperor in European history, and he's also the founder of the First Reich. Many of you are familiar with 20th century history and World War II, and you're aware of the fact that the German army and the government of Hitler was often referred to as the Third Reich. Well, Hitler was playing on history, everybody. He was trying to be Charlemagne. And so he created the Third Reich. But the first one is Charlemagne. There is going to be a second one, which I will mention later in lecture, but it's not going to happen for quite a while. So now you have the church developing influence into the political system of Europe. They can now make or break kings. That's power, that's influence. The church also dominates the European population through its control of the spoken language. If you want to conduct business over the greater European continent, you're going to do so in Latin. The church also dictates that even though writing wasn't a highly developed skill amongst the European population at this time, there were people who could write and there were people who were authors. And sometimes they would write inflammatory books. But the church really didn't care too much about it so long as they published in Latin. And the church understood that the vast majority of Europeans couldn't read Latin. They were peasants. They only spoke their local dialect, whatever that was. So there was no argument amongst the greater population because only a few people could read the darn thing anyway. The church also tried to control the language because in their opinion, if everybody had the ability to actually read the Bible, some of you who are familiar with it, this is nothing, I'm not trying to make a negative point here or anything, but there are a lot of contradictions within the Bible. And thoughtful people, rightly so, ask questions. Well, it says this over here, but then, later in this gospel over there, it says something a little bit different. Well, what's the exact meaning? Well, the church was trying to avoid all of these endless arguments about the interpretation of the Bible. So they demanded that everybody speak Latin, knowing that really about the only people that could speak Latin and read it were probably the court administrators working for all the various kings. In some instances, not even the king spoke Latin. It was his government, his administrators, you might say, his foreign minister. He spoke Latin, so he could read all of these things, but nobody else could. And that's power, everybody. And so how do you communicate with a population that can't read? How do you do that? If the church actually wants the population to know and understand something, how do you send that message to them? And if they can't read or write, the only option left to Europeans living, say between the years 800 and 1600, how do you send a message to the population that can't read? You don't have modern electronics. Heck, paper hasn't even been invented yet. So how do you send messages to the greater population? And you do this through art and architecture. It's your form of propaganda. So you build these churches that are absolutely magnificent. And you do so not only for the glory of God, you do so in order to overawe the population. God is all powerful. God sees everything. And to give you an example of how total the commitment of the greater European population was to their Christian faith, everybody. Many of you are familiar with the church in Paris, France called Notre Dame. That's an absolutely magnificent church. It's a Gothic design. It was completed sometime around the year 1200 AD. That church took nearly 400 years to build. And we have absolutely no clue as to who the architects were, who the bricklayers were, who the actual artists that painted the mosaics on the wall. I mean, we have no clue as to who that is. And the reason there's no information on this, everybody, is because your ego meant nothing. This was all about the glorification of God. And so you build these absolutely wonderful, tremendous, and huge cathedrals. You are going to impress the population. And you do so with art as well. So this dominance over the European population tends, because this is a human endeavor, everybody, this has really not much to do with Christianity in itself. It has more to do with human figures than it does Christianity. And this kind of control that the church begins to exhibit over the European population becomes very tempting over the centuries. People begin to look at the office of the Pope, okay, as basically a very lucrative job opportunity. If we, as a family, if we can put one of our sons in the office of and make him Pope, our family will be enriched many, many times over. Because once this person is elected Pope, he could make his sons cardinals. He could make his sons bishops. He can marry his daughters off to the various royal families of Europe and thus create a family dynasty. This tradition goes on for hundreds of years. And then you start to approach the Renaissance, which is where I left off last week. Some significant events that led up to the Renaissance, I already mentioned it to you, and that had to do with the year 1453. The Roman Empire officially comes to an end. The city of Constantinople has been overrun by Muslim armies and it has been captured. Constantinople is going to be renamed Istanbul, and it is now Muslim. The Caliph himself lives in Istanbul. His palace is still standing today in Istanbul. So the end of the Roman Empire. Shortly before the empire collapses, scholars are going to start everybody's aware that the city is doomed. And so there's a mass exodus of the scholars, and they're bringing with them information within their various libraries. And of this, it contains much of the learning of the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks. Western scholars have never had access to this before. So they are unfamiliar with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Euripides and many, many, many other authors, scientists, architects, and engineers. They're unfamiliar with this. And by the time you get to the 1450s, there is an awakening of the European population. Keep in mind, everybody, they started out as tribesmen. At the time of Constantine, these people are tribesmen. But over the centuries, as they settle down, and at first it's villages, then it's small towns, and then occasionally here and there a large metropolitan city arises. And I'm talking about London, Paris, Rome, Venice was another one, Berlin. These cities just begin to emerge. And by the time we get to 1453, there's the beginnings of an awakening here, everybody. People are wanting to learn. They want to know how to read and write. They want to understand basic mathematics. And so when these Eastern scholars bring with them all of this treasure trove of books and manuscripts and whatnot, many Western scholars couldn't get enough of it. They were absolutely voracious readers of this stuff, and it absolutely fascinated them. Because in 1453, the ruins of the great Colosseum is still sitting in the city of Rome. It's nowhere near its original grandeur. It's nearly 1,500 years old at this time, and it's seen some wear and tear over the years, but it's still fascinated the Westerners because they had no clue as to how the Romans were able to build such a huge structure. Now they have that information right there in front of them, and they can't get enough of it. And so you have the opening of the Renaissance coinciding with the reawakening. This is what the word Renaissance means. It means rebirth. And Europeans are going to basically, you might say culturally, wake up for the first time in their history. They're no longer tribesmen anymore. They're slowly, this is the infancy here. They're slowly going to start to wake up, and they're eventually going to develop the idea of a nation state. That's never happened before. And so this language, this idea of creating a nation state, it's in its infancy. Even the most educated can't really articulate exactly what it is they're looking for, but they know that there is something wrong with the current system in Europe at that time, and it had to do with the control that the church exerted over the entire continent. The office of the papacy is in some ways been diminished in its morality because of its abuse of power. Popes would oftentimes use the office, their their access to the resources of the church, as I mentioned earlier, to further enrich their own families. They oftentimes married off their children to the various royal houses of Europe, thus establishing connections to the royal bloodlines within Europe. And then there's just the general abuse of the office that occurs because there's a number of popes during the Renaissance period, and I'm calling this 1450 to 1550. During this time period, there's a series of popes that their behavior within the church is, by today's standards, even absolutely outrageous. You know, when you think about these are the holy fathers within the church, and when you read about some of the behavior going on inside behind closed doors, it's just mind-boggling. Let your imagination run wild, and it had to do with pleasures of the flesh, and it had to do with this bloodlust that seemed to be common in that time period. It wasn't just the Pope. A lot of people had this. They actually enjoyed watching convicts being somehow creatively executed. So they might throw the convict in a ring and then maybe throw a bunch of rabid dogs in there and sit there and watch them tear them apart. They may even, in one instance, the Pope's eldest son was practicing his swordsmanship on the convicts that they would kick into the room where he was at, and he would practice on them and basically kill them. So the behavior of the church is going to be noticed not just by the elite in Europe, everybody, but it's going to start being noticed by the average peasant in Europe as well. And that's going to spell trouble for the church, because for generation after generation after generation, they've been taught that, you know, how good the church is, whatever word comes out of Rome, that's the word of God, and we must obey regardless. And now we are finding out that the cardinals and the bishops live in palaces that even the kings of Europe look to. You know, how does living in a palace, having servants, having mistresses, having children, having the equivalent of millions and millions and millions of dollars stuffed away in a bank somewhere? I mean, these are bishops and cardinals. How does that happen? We're supposed to be living these meek, mild lives. Material objects are not supposed to mean anything to us. It's our soul that is so important. Yet, why are the cardinals and bishops living in the sea of materialism and abuse of power? And so the awakening is going to occur in the early 1500s. Two major events, actually three of them, are going to happen within the first decade of the 1500s. So between 1500 and 1510. The first one is going to be the election of Pope Julius II in 1503. And the reason that is significant, everybody, is because Julius is the one who is going to tear down the original Vatican built by Constantine himself. And that should give you some idea of the force of his personality, that he can command people to tear down a 1,200-year-old church that has 1,200 years of history in it. There are popes buried in there. The walls are encrusted with jewels. The doors are covered in solid plate gold. And he wants to tear this down and build a new Vatican. Why does he want to build a new Vatican? He's aware, he's becoming aware of the disillusionment of the European population. And he wants to recapture their imagination. They can't read or write. He still has to send his messages through art and architecture. So he puts into the works, he starts the project. He doesn't live to see it finished, but he starts it. He starts the demolition of the original Vatican, and he starts the construction of the Vatican that you see today. If you've never been to the city of Rome, please, by all means, put it on your bucket list. You have to see this church to believe it. It is absolutely magnificent. And it was constructed during a time period in which art engineers and architects were just learning how the Romans did all of this. And like I said, they were absolutely voracious readers. They could not get enough of this. And they applied this knowledge that they were getting to the construction of the Vatican. And it was, for them, this was absolutely thrilling stuff. The second major event that's going to occur in this decade is the election of King Henry VIII in England in 1509. And the reason this is significant, everybody, is because it's going to be Henry that is going to split England from the church. The English, after Henry is done, the English are no longer Roman Catholics. They're Christians, but they're no longer Roman Catholics. They're no longer a member of the church. So that is significant. The third major event, also in the year 1509, is the publication of a scientific paper. And it is by a man by the name of Copernicus. He is a Polish priest, but he's also a highly educated mathematician. And it is Copernicus who speculates and shows mathematically how it is that the earth is not the center of the universe. It is Copernicus that says earth is nothing more than an ordinary planet going around the sun. The sun does not go around the earth. We go around the sun. Well, the church doctrine was teaching the population that the earth was the center of the universe. Heaven was above, somewhere above the clouds. Hell was somewhere deep below the earth. And that made the earth the middle, the center of everything. And now this Polish priest says, no. Copernicus is going to be excommunicated from the church, and then he's eventually going to spend the rest of his adult life in hiding because the church put a price on his head. Shortly after this happens, we're going to get to the year 1517, and this is the year of Martin Luther. You see, in order to pay for all of this art and architecture that the church was commissioning, and I'm talking about the construction of the Vatican, it made a lot of artists and a lot of architects very wealthy. And the church had to pay for all of this. Now, normally the church collects its income, and for those of you who are practicing Catholics, you know this. Every Sunday, there's the tithe. They pass the basket around. You're supposed to present. This is traditional. Not everybody does this, I understand. And that's, the church doesn't make it mandatory, but traditionally you give up 10% of your income to the church. And so they also, that's called a tithe, by the way. And then on Sundays also, for those of you who are practicing Catholics, you're aware that they pass the basket around, that kind of thing. And it's supposed to be used for good and noble works, feeding the poor and all that stuff, and building shelters and things like that. But in this particular time period, the church is having to pay for all that art and architecture. And it's expensive. You've got architects and artists like Michelangelo and a man by the name of Bramante. These people don't come cheap. And then you've got to buy all the materials for this church. And then you have a series of popes that are, let's say, less than perfect. In the middle of all this, in the year 1517, the particular pope is Leo X. And he's from the city of Florence. His family name is Medici. They are the wealthiest family in Florence. They pretty much run the city of Florence. The patriarch of the family, which was Leo's father, his name was Lorenzo. He was pretty much like the mafia don over the city of Florence, and he gets his son, he's made a cardinal. He was able to basically purchase the cardinal's hat for his son when he was about 13. In the year 1513, he's going to be made pope. And he's a bit of a pleasure seeker. He owes his allegiance more to his family than he does the church itself. And he's a lover of basically good times. He's a very cultured individual. And he enjoys hosting extravagant dinner parties in the Lateran Palace, which was the residence of the Pope. This was the old Roman palace that Constantine gave to Pope Sylvester and said, here, this is your new house. And that palace is still there today. And so this Pope Leo is Leo X, is hosting these lavish dinner parties in this palace. Well, this doesn't sit well with the population because the tithe, the money that the church is raising, is coming from all of these peasants. And many of them have made pilgrimages to the city of Rome, and they've seen for themselves the abuse of power that is going on. They're seeing that cardinals and bishops are living in palaces that not even kings have. The Pope himself is basically just another king in Europe. He's just number one amongst equal, he's first among equals, that's all. And so the lifestyle that they are witnessing goes in contrast to the teachings in the Bible. Where is it in the Bible that says, thou shalt drink off of gold goblets and live in palaces and keep mistresses? And, and so the population is starting to become very weary of paying all these tithes to the church, and it's not going towards projects, say, in their own communities. Nobody's getting a brand new shelter of some kind. There's no money being spent to improve water sources. There's no money being spent to build defenses around the villages or possibly improve roads. None of that is happening. And the church needs more and more money to pay for all of this construction and the pretty much the lifestyle of the Pope. And it turns out that the money that they're receiving from the peasant population is not enough. They need more. And so they keep coming up with these schemes to raise ever more money. And I'm not making fun of it or making light of it, but that's basically what these were schemes. The Pope and his banker are devising new ways to basically tax the various populations of Europe. And the only tools at their disposal is, you got to remember, the church is in charge of your soul, and you firmly believe this. So what happens is much of the schemes that they develop are directed towards the saving of your soul. And let's give you an example here. Once the plan was put into place, the church would send out there was a particular monk, and it's not important that you know who he is, but there was a particular monk that would then, when the Pope declares or makes a decree, and he wants to actually send a written piece of paper out to the population. Remember, they can't read or write, so how do you do this? This piece of paper is called a bull. Within the Roman Catholic Church, a bull is basically a declaration. It's like, okay, the Pope says this, and it's about a paragraph or two. And so this priest would go out throughout Europe, because he could read Latin, and he would read it out loud to all the various villages that he would go to. And so it's this particular mechanism that they're going to use to try and draw ever more money out of the population. And I'm going to go straight to the end here and tell you that they went through one scheme after another. And then finally, this was the straw that's going to break the camel's back here. They're going to send this monk out. He's going to go to all these various villages, and he is going to tell the population, because this is what the Pope has declared, that you can purchase salvation. Isn't that kind of cool? You can commit whatever sin you want to, but if you put enough money in the bowl, the Pope, who is a priest, has the power to absolve sin. So you could do the most vile sins, and if you put enough money in the bowl, they'll absolve them for you. No questions asked. Is that cool? Well, it gets better. That's not able to raise enough money, so they come up with another scheme. This one here says, if you put enough money in the bowl, you can buy salvation for, say, a dead loved one. Maybe your dad died, and he probably wasn't a very nice guy. Possibly he beat your mother. Maybe he beat you as a child. But he's your dad, you care for him, that kind of thing. But because of his behavior in life, he's now sitting in purgatory. That's where his soul is located. If you put enough money in the bowl, the Pope has the power to absolve him and move him from purgatory beyond the pearly gates. That raises a little bit of money, but it ain't enough. The final one, you can purchase absolution for sins you haven't even committed yet. That is way cool. So if I wanted to kill somebody, I could go buy absolution beforehand and then go about my business knowing that when I was done, I was absolved. Is that cool? Well, this priest who is taking these declarations and collecting this money happens to be on a village that is near the German border. And right across the German border is what you today would call a college town. It was the city of Wittenberg, Germany. It's a college town. There's a university there. The population is made up mostly of students of one kind or another. And right across the border, just a mile or two away from Wittenberg, is this other little village called Worms. And it's a popular drinking location for the students. And for those of you in this class, you probably know how that is. There's probably a favorite gathering, watering hole amongst a couple of you. You know, it's typical college activity. But this priest comes through the town at this particular time, and he starts making this declaration that you could purchase salvation in advance of the sin. And these college students are listening to this, and they're wondering, you know, because most of them are theology students. The idea that there's a physics department doesn't exist yet. There is no such thing as a history department or anything like that. Most of these students are theology students. So when this priest starts his dog and pony show selling these absolutions, these kids are naturally curious about it, and they start listening to him. And when the guy finishes, they're all thinking to themselves, is this a bunch of horse shit or what? So they take a copy of this declaration and they return it back to their university, and they present it to their professor, whose name happens to be Martin Luther. And he reads it and he declares, oh, hell no. No, 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 no. There is nowhere in the Bible that says you can do this. And this is definitely wrong on so many levels. So it's Martin Luther that raises his voice. And here's something I want you to know for the sake of the exam, everybody. When I was talking about how the church was trying to tax the peasant population, most of these peasants that they're taxing are coming from an area known as Central Europe. And for the most part, everybody, that means Germans. So throughout the centuries, the German peoples at large are feeling abused and picked on by the church, because they're not only having to put up with this scam that the church is presenting by purchasing absolution. There's been plenty of examples in history. Who the heck do you think paid for the Crusades? The church had to tax the population in order to pay for the Crusades. Well, where did that money come from? The peasant population of Europe. And for the most part, those were Germans. And in return, they saw absolutely nothing. And in some instances, when they turned over money to the church, supposedly for the purpose of a crusade, it ended up being diverted into building a palace or something of that nature. And so by the time you get to 1517, the Germans are now a little sensitive to the idea of being abused in such a way. They're not happy. And Martin Luther is the voice they've been looking for. And so he is going to present his famous 95 Theses that he is going to print publicly in response to these this purchase of absolutions. And so you've got the beginning of the greater split within the Roman Catholic Church, because when it's all over with, everybody, you now have Protestants and then you have Roman Catholics. And in the midst of all of this, You have the split started with Martin Luther. You have Copernicus telling everybody Earth is not the center of the universe. You got a king who's been elected who is eventually going to separate his country from the church. And then you got a German monk who is going to try and take the entire German population away from you. You're beginning to lose your grip on the European population. Okay, I am going to finish this lecture tomorrow, and we may be here a little bit longer than an hour, so have patience with me because I want to go over the exam in the same fashion that I did for exam 1 so that you know precisely what it is you need to look for in your notes, okay? And once again, I will then send the exam out to you on Wednesday morning. You will have the entire day to take the exam, return the answer sheet back to me by Thursday, 9 a.m. And we will meet at Thursday, 10 a.m. Okay? If there are no questions, I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.